Well, thank you for letting me spend a bit of time talking to you all. It's a real privilege, so thank you. So Andy's given the subject of indifference, and I thought of coming on and looking very indifferent, but I just thought, no, I won't pull that off, so why bother? But anyway, the subject, of indifference, I found quite hard, particularly because in the context of us sharing our faith. When you get an indifferent response, I don't know, there's nothing to go on it. You know, where do you go with it, really? And so actually, indifference is quite a tough one, in a sense, when we experience it, I find. And the title there, Indifference, Why Bother? The why bother is, maybe the response that comes back when we share something about Jesus is, why should I bother with it? And when we get that response, sometimes our response back is, why should I bother even telling you then? And it can be a very sort of negative spiral almost, indifference. So let's sort of open it up a little bit and explore maybe what indifference is and how best that we can sort of approach it, I guess. So, if the slides are going to work for me today, let's start with a few numbers. Always like a little sort of delve into some stats. There was a survey in 2010 by the Church of England about how young people relate to Christianity. And there was various tick boxes, and one of them was, I don't really know what to think. And actually 43%, which is quite high, said, I don't really know what to think. Interesting, sort of an indifferent response. Another survey by the University of Cologne around the same sort of time put it as just less than 40% of people in the UK were indifferent to religion. So that's not just Christianity, it's any sort of form of religion. And indeed, there was an indifference there. Another survey, was a bit slightly more recently by the COV and the Evangelical Alliance in 2015, found what they did is they did a survey where they said, when somebody's spoken to you about Jesus, what's your response? And about 60% of the people said they didn't want to know any more about Jesus. And that particular report said that there was a widespread disinterest in Christianity and in Christian teachings. It's quite high, and that sort of sets the scene, I guess, for where we are. Maybe these stats aren't surprising to you. Maybe that's sort of what you'd expect. I don't know. This was an interesting thing. I don't know how many people remember this. This was, 2008, I think it was, that sort of time. The Secular Society decided to go on a poster campaign in London, and on the bendy buses, they posted this on the side that said, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy life. Obviously created a little bit of furore in some circles, but it was interesting because on censuses, I'm not sure what plural of censuses is, 12% of Britons identify as being explicitly atheists and 9% call themselves agnostic. It's relatively small numbers, not insignificant. And actually, over the years, that sort of number hasn't changed. So there's no sort of going away from Christianity to something else. It seems to be just in this sort of indifferent malaise, really, I guess, about what people think about faith. That's the sort of feeling I get from the numbers. And maybe we could be honest with ourselves. We live in a very secular society. And my thoughts are really that I think in a sense of actually not identifying or pinning your colours to the mast of any particular creed or religion is where a lot of people feel secure. The 2001 census said something around the order of about 70% of people said they were Christians, quite a high number. I think 2011 was just below 60%. Now, you sort of try and marry up all these sort of numbers. You think, well, I don't see that number of people in church today. So why are people saying that they're Christian, but they're not really doing anything about it? Interesting, there was a chap called David Vars, a professor in Manchester, who came up with this idea of fuzzy faith, and I think it probably sort of makes sense. He had this sort of argument that really people who may tick a box and say they're Christian actually have this sort of fuzzy faith where it's not really that well defined. And he put some ideas here about having a vaguely defined notion of a divine entity, or they tend to believe in a higher power rather than a personal God, and go to church only for the main festivals or life's rites of passage, weddings and funerals and that sort of thing. And that's sort of sort of adds up in my mind. That's probably what a lot of people are doing. There's sort of this very vague sort of sense of God, but I don't really define it. I'm quite comfortable maybe not defining it as well. You know, we've all heard people say to us, oh, well, let's the heavens decide, or I've got an angel watching over me. They're all sort of things that hint that there's a sense of something, but I'm not really going to define it. I don't going to sign up to any particular sort of strong form of that. So that's sort of me just trying to paint the landscape. We have a very indifferent to Christianity sort of society that we live in at the moment. So let's get going and say, what is indifference? How would I define it if I looked it up in the dictionary? Well, there you go. The quality of not caring about or being interested in something or someone. I've actually wanted to extend this slightly and say it's the quality of not showing that you're caring or being interested in something or someone. I think a lot of us are very good maybe at sort of presenting indifference, but actually under the covers, maybe there's something going on that we just don't see, and we can be easily put off by if we don't see it. That's just a thought. We'll carry that thought through a little bit later. Right. So, indifference. What I want to try and cover this morning, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but 3 things just to help us thinking about when we're presented with indifference. How do we respond? What does it look like? Why do we see it? And I've got some ideas and thoughts on that. And maybe more importantly, how do we respond? Okay, so that's just a little map of where we're going. Okay, right, my little emoji friends here. So what I'm trying to do is the context of us maybe sharing our faith, something about what we believe to people around us, friends, colleagues. What does it look like when we do that and we get indifference? What does indifference look like? Well, here's a few thoughts, and this is, I suppose, to a degree from my own experience, really. People would say to me, that's great, Graham. Yeah, but it's not really for me. Or maybe they'll say, okay, that's fine, each to their own. You have that, I'll have this. Or maybe, I'm really glad it's working out for you. Maybe I've shared something about my faith, and that's great. I'm really pleased that it's working for you, but, that's for you, really. And this is sort of polite, sort of standoff. That's been a lot of my experience. And as I said earlier, I find that quite hard sometimes, because where do I go with that, really? They've almost said, back off. I've got a colleague, a friend at work, who came to me one day and said, Graham, could we go for a little walk at lunchtime? I just want to talk to you about something. Fine. And so we met up at lunch and we went for a walk around the park near where I work. And we had this long conversation. Basically, he knew I was a Christian and wanted to explore a little bit about faith. Interestingly, he didn't want to do it in the office. He was quite happy doing it as we walked around the site. And we spent this hour talking in detail about my faith, sharing a lot of things. And it went really well. He was really engaged in what I was saying, and I thought, this is great. And at the end, I said, really what I think we should do is see if we can get you signed up to an Alpha course, because that would be great. You can explore this a bit more, and you'll be with other people and maybe asking similar sort of questions. So anyway, he said, great, yep, let's do that. So I found an Alpha course that was near where he lived, and I went along to the introductory session with him, and he was really engaged with it, and you could just sense that, this was right, just hitting the mark for him. Brilliant. Then, and he was going to sign up for it, he was going to go for it. And then about 2 or 3 days later, he came up to me in the office, and when some people approach you, you think, ooh, you've got something big to tell me, haven't you? And it was one of those moments, and he said, Graham, I don't want to really talk about this anymore, but I've decided not to do the Alpha course. Yeah, where'd you go with that, really? So I sort of said, oh, I'm sorry about that, and tried to sort of leave the door open, gave him a little booklet, and I was talking to him last week, actually. I'm trying to keep the door open, but I can't really go there because he's made a decision, whatever reason, he doesn't want to share it, he doesn't want to go any further with it. Now, imagine that you met that person. You obviously wouldn't know, what the story I've just told. But I imagine, I don't know for sure, but I imagine you get a very indifferent response about anything you might share about your own faith to him. So you don't actually know the history to what's happened. But that indifference is really difficult to know what to do with. But actually, something's been going on, in his life. So you get these polite responses, and that's probably what you get with my friend. But there's probably some stuff under the covers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So I love the story that Jesus told of the parable of the banquet. If you remember that one, it was the one where this rich sort of host laid on this big event, lavish event, and he invited various people to it, and everything was set up, and then he sent his staff out on the day, and they came back with some excuses, as you may know the story. There was, I've just bought a field and I must go and see it, please excuse me. Or the old 5 yoke of oxen excuse, I've used that a few times, very good one. Or even, I've just got married. Well, that's a pretty reasonable excuse. They're all very polite, aren't they? But the response of the host wasn't too good. He said, right, blow you lot then, I'm going to go and find some people who will come to my party. Now, I think we're all probably a little bit frustrated when we get this very indifferent response. I'm not saying we should get angry like that, like the host there, but that's quite tough. It is sometimes tough to face those sort of indifferent, polite excuses to something you think is brilliant that you're trying to offer people. And probably one of the hardest things that I think it looks like is just silence. I think we get a little bit more of this today, maybe in social media, maybe just generally we could send an email to someone, we get nothing back. In all sorts of contexts, that's pretty tough when we get nothing back. But certainly when we shared something we believe is really important and there's just nothing. That's sometimes what indifference can look like, I guess. So, why do we see indifference? Yeah, that's a good question, really. And I think when we look at this, we have to realize that everybody is individual and everybody's got their own story inside of them going on. And sometimes we just don't see it. We have to bear that in mind, I think. Here's some ideas, anyway. One of them could be the person is feeling that their life's fine. You know, why do I need this? You know, we live, generally speaking, I think, in a very wealthy society. I'm talking very generally here. You know, we have good health care. And maybe the person you're talking to is enjoying that, as well as maybe their family relationships are good, their social setting's good, they're able to enjoy their sports and their hobbies, whatever it is. Maybe you're approaching somebody who's in that place, and you rock up with this story about Jesus. Well, why do I really want him as well in my life? Especially if we actually hint that maybe you might have to give up some things. Well, you know, that's maybe just something I don't want to really go with. So that's certainly one reason, I think. There's a chap in the Old Testament. He was a prophet, and he was called Hosea. It's called Hosea for some reason, and he said this, and this was in the context of the Israelite nation. So this was a prophet. He was talking to the Israelites, and he said this: "When I fed them, they were satisfied. When they were satisfied, they became proud. Then they forgot me." I guess we can all probably grasp that, you know, when things are good, we sort of don't need God as much. We probably don't like to think that, but that's sometimes just how we react. So we can't be too judgmental of people who're living lives that they don't think, well, why do I need Jesus as well? Maybe. There was this also this story of Jesus and the rich young man. It's a story by the gospel writer who obviously spoke it. And he said this, that Jesus was approached by this young man. And this young man, he was wealthy, obviously. And he came and said, "Jesus, I want to follow you. I really want to follow you. I've been really good. I've kept the law. I'm doing everything I should be doing. I want to follow you." Now, I might be reading between the lines a little bit, so please forgive me. But I just imagine it went something like this, that I think Jesus, you know, saw the young man's enthusiasm, saw that he was really wanting to follow him. And just as everything seemed settled, he probably went to the young man, "Oh, by the way, I need you to sell all your possessions, give them to the poor, then come and follow me." Oof. that must have been a bit tough, really, for someone who's so enthusiastic. And this rich young man, it says, went away really sad. I wonder, reading in between the lines a little bit, if you'd have gone to him maybe a couple of weeks later, and you'd have said, what about this great teacher, Jesus, we've all been hearing about? You might have got quite an indifferent response, because he knew there was a big cost to following Jesus. I don't know if I can really do that. So, sometimes we don't always know the backstory, but maybe there are people like that we talk to that have just struggled for whatever reason. I think in today's society, we do live in a world that's full of stuff in terms of people talking at us, all sorts of things. And if you think about that survey sort of mentioned right at the start, the 43% who said, I don't really know what to think. I guess some of them might be in this sort of camp. I don't really know. There's just, there is so much stuff that is being said at me through social media, through the media generally, through friends. How do I make sense of all of this? How can I sort of take, you're telling me about Jesus, yet I've got all this other stuff going on in my brain. That's quite tough sometimes, and we've got to maybe understand we are sometimes in information overload, and particularly on spiritual stuff. Sometimes it's just a bit too much. So maybe that's one reason why sometimes we see this. This was an interesting one, really, when I was thinking about it. And I put it here that maybe some people think church looks incredibly unattractive. I get really, really frustrated sometimes when I see how church is represented in the media and on TV dramas or whatever. You probably all seen it from the wild and wacky sort of Louis Theroux goes to some weird Baptist church in America and they all get bitten by snakes and, it's all a bit weird. From something to something like, they have these TV dramas, the ones where there's this sort of, really sort of foisty, impotent little group of people, this really insipid vicar in a medieval building, and we got the last one, but a lot of that, that's people's sort of view of what church is. And so you sort of come talking about Jesus, and somehow they make a connection that that's what I'm going to end up. No, I'm not sure. I'll politely sort of decline. That I think we can sometimes see that, really. And I'll just say as well, what's really sometimes important as well is that, when we are in church, is that our language is really important as well, and our behaviours. What I'm thinking particularly is, and we've talked about it, I think, as Bridge before, that what's really actually important is that we talk language that people understand. If you just approach somebody just with your faith and your opening line is, you need to be washed in the blood of the Lamb, it would be a bit, it's important phrases to us. We understand it, but to a lot of people they wouldn't. Language is really, really important. I was reminded of this actually quite recently. Interestingly, we, as a family, many years used to go to La Paz holiday camp in France. It's a spring holiday camp that you might remember or might know of. We've been several years with quite a few friends and from church as well. And one particular year, there was a real problem with mosquito bites. You get that sort of time of year. And we were getting bitten all over the place. And we were mentioning it, and the Beckleys were with us, and Dawn kindly mentioned, you should really use Tiger Balm. You came out with some Tiger Balm, I can't remember it. And I would recommend it, actually. If you're getting bitten by mosquitoes, Tiger Balm is actually really good. You can get it over the counter. Anyway, this Tiger Balm is fantastic. And we mentioned it to our daughter Esther, who seems to be very susceptible to mosquito bites. And I think it was Alex got a bottle of this a little jar of this from Dawn and said, Esther, you must use this. Honestly, Dawn swears by it. It's brilliant. Now, what we hadn't realized is that actually, and we only found out this recently, which I find quite surprising, is that actually Esther never heard that phrase before. She literally thought that Tiger Balm, Dawn was putting it on herself and swearing. That's what she thought. It was the most bizarre sort of misunderstanding of things. She swears by it, exactly, yeah. And she said, well, impotent stuff, that's really powerful stuff. You better be careful about it. we just don't realise, I didn't realise that, so we only found out recently. Our language is so important in church, we just don't sometimes realise how it can make people feel this place is a place I don't belong. We want this place to be somewhere that anybody who comes through the door feels they can belong. And so we need to think about our language and the behaviour when we're in this church. Past experiences of Christians hasn't been good. I think that's another reason I was thinking about this. And I think sometimes we haven't done ourselves really many favours, I think, as Christians, about how we've behaved. And I'm not talking about language, I'm just talking about just general behaviour. I think of a couple of times this has been really sad for me in a sense. I have a cousin who's quite old, a bit older than me. And I remember hearing the story. I wasn't there, but I remember the story of when he and his wife went to a church to have a daughter christened. It's quite typical. And this is going back to the mid-70s, I think. So it's quite a while ago. So I remember hearing this story, but apparently during the service, the baby became quite unsettled, it was crying. And the vicar at the time was really struggling with it, got quite angry, and said in a very sort of cross, angry voice to my cousin, says, "Can you stop that child from screaming? Maybe hit it or something." And it's quite shocking, really, isn't it? Even for the 1970s, that was quite a brutal experience. And unsurprisingly, they've never been to a church again. Tragic, really sad. Now, I wasn't brought up in a Christian family. It wasn't until I must have been about 14, I think, and my parents were invited to a local Pentecostal church. It's a fantastic church, and I've had many lifelong friends from that. And they became Christians quite quickly. They were engaged with it. And there was me as this sort of 14-year-old, 15-year-old who was not really sure about this. Do I really want to sort of commit myself to this sort of Christian faith and all this stuff, really? I wasn't sure. But I remember, and so there was a lot of lovely people in that church, one or two interesting characters, shall I say, as well. And I remember as a 15-year-old, I think this person came to me and said, and they looked at me and they said this exactly like this. They looked at me and said, "Graham, do you want to go to hell?" I remember thinking, no, not really, no. It was one of those moments you think, oh my gosh. Now, hell is an important thing to talk about. Heaven is an important thing. That they're important subjects. But I think as Christians, we sometimes don't do ourselves proud by how we communicate, how we come across. And we have to think about that. And sometimes people have had some experiences of Christians maybe not being the best that they can be. And that can be in the mix, maybe, of why people would be indifferent and sort of say, well, no, I'll hold back. So, finally then, I want to think about how do we respond? What I'm going to do, really, and maybe it's picking up a little on the exercise that Martha did, I want us, first of all, to think about the person that we're talking to about our faith. How do we respond? What's it like to be indifferent? Well, we've explored it a little bit in our little icebreaker. But I want you to just think about something that you're disinterested in, something that you just don't find that exciting, but other people around you may be very excited. So maybe, we've touched on some of these things earlier, so maybe it's politics. And I must confess I'm a little bit indifferent with politics. Partly because I think a general election, I know where I live, it's always going to be a Tory party sort of return. That's just how it is. So I sometimes feel a little bit disengaged, maybe. Or maybe you're still not engaged with the football. I don't know. There may be someone or two who still aren't. I don't know. Or maybe maybe it's recycling. You hear a lot about it, but it hasn't really grabbed you. Or maybe it's the NHS waiting lists, or even just potholes outside your road. There are people around us who are very passionate about a lot of these things, and none of those are necessarily bad. They're all good things, but they just don't get it, really. I think it's really important to sort of just think again. How I feel is quite a human response. And when we're talking to people and they're feeling indifferent, that's a human response as well, for various reasons that I've suggested, but for whatever it is. we mustn't be negative or very downbeat to people who are coming across as indifferent. There may be all sorts of reasons, and we need to think and engage with those. So always put ourselves there first, put ourselves in their shoes. I think that doesn't hurt to start with. There we go. So how do we respond ourselves? Okay. So let's look at ourselves, really. The first thing I just wanted to, is just some thoughts, really. But I think the first thing for me was to remain convinced of the gospel. I think when we're sharing our faith and we get a very negative response, it can affect us. I think, we sort of hinted at it earlier, and I think we shouldn't undermine or downplay that sometimes. When someone, you're presenting something that you care about, that you're passionate about, and we get a very negative response, I think remaining convinced of the gospel is really important. Jesus said, "For the mouth speaks what the heart is full of." Being strong and firm, actually the gospel that we have is the most incredibly powerful, life-changing message that we could ever give anybody. And being convinced of that, remaining solid in that, I think is really helpful. Paul, one of Jesus' followers wrote a letter to the Romans, and he said this, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God that brings salvation to anyone who believes." Really, remain convinced of that gospel. And I think, let's just go on. Learn when to stop, that's right. Yes, now, some of us, this is easier than others, I guess. But learning when to stop is quite important, I think. And Jesus actually had this sentence that he said to his disciples when he was sending them out. He said, "Look, if you're not welcomed, not listened to, quietly withdraw. Don't make a scene, shrug your shoulders and be on your way." Now, a lot of us, when we share something that's really important to us, we want a response. Otherwise, we get frustrated. Maybe we feel, in the context of sharing our faith, a little bit guilty, nothing's happening, or just feeling a failure, I guess, really. We should never feel that. And I think it's really important because we have to remember that when we share our faith, we are just part of a big story in people's lives. That, sharing our faith is actually something that God is taking and using as many other things that are going on in people's lives. And I think it's really important to not feel it's just our responsibility. It's God's work, not ours. We want people to find God, not just take up what we've said. And sometimes we have to go silent, and that's fine. That's okay sometimes. What I actually love about this as well is the thought that I think it was Philip and Gordon shared this on our community Sunday, which was a few weeks ago. Some of us were going out and we were talking to people, asking some questions. And I remember Gordon and Philip have sort of fed back that they were at a distance and watched somebody from Bridge and just asked some questions to some passers-by. There was this conversation. Then it naturally ended and people separated. But what they said is that they saw that the conversation carried on after that they'd had the conversation with the people who'd been approached, carried on afterwards. And I think we've got to remember that, when we plant a seed, it carries on in people's minds even. They'll have their own conversations in their own heads, but even with other people. Don't feel that when we stop, God stops. He does keep going. And that's really important, I think, to grasp. It takes some of the pressure off, I think, sometimes as well. And finally, but no means least, is to watch and pray. Now, it's fairly obvious, and this is a sort of a phrase maybe we've heard before, but actually, I think when we get an indifferent response and we've stopped, actually, we can still watch and pray. It was, again, a person called Paul who said this, "Pray diligently, stay alert, with your eyes wide open in gratitude." And I love this combination of praying, but watching, praying with your eyes open almost. And particularly if this is, maybe you're sharing your faith or people in the office know you're a Christian, you pray, but you just watch. Watch for those opportunities that may well come your way. And that's really important, I think. And then I was going to finish just with one final thought, that there are some people that we are watching and praying who are people who are very close to us. They could be very close family, could be close friends. And actually, this indifference that we experience from them is particularly hard. We care for them, we love them, but we just don't get anything back. And we see them quite regularly, probably, if they're close friends or family, and we still don't get anything back. And that can be quite hard. My encouragement really is this, that for those people who, if you're in that situation, is to keep watching, keep praying, keep loving them and following their story, and you keep being that fantastic signpost that you are to our amazing and lovely Jesus who we follow. So I'm going to finish just with this last slide, and I found this very helpful in this context. Billy Graham said, "Never forget that God isn't bound by time the way we are. We only see the present moment. God sees everything. We see only part of what he is doing. He sees it all." And if we could just pray together.